Hello, welcome. My name is Shane Strange, and I'm coming to you from the comfy chair here at Queensland Poetry. And I welcome you to this panel, Borderless, part of the Emerge Online series of the Queensland Poetry Festival. Queensland Poetry operates on the dispossessed land of the Yagara and Turrbal country, over which Indigenous sovereignty was never ceded. We acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal elders past and present who have the right and responsibility to care for country according to wisdom passed down over thousands of generations, and to the ancestors who gifted that land to the Yagara and Turrbal people. At Queensland Poetry, we're committed to promoting and supporting voices and poets of country. So guess what? We've launched our annual suite of poetry prizes and awards today, including the Thomas Shapcott Prize, the Val Vallis Award for a single poem, the XYZ Prize for Excellence in Spoken Word, and the Udru Noonuckle Prize for Poets of Country. All of this can be found at our website, as well as the full festival program. Our live festival is happening in June, and we have a series of online events happening in the lead up to that. Take a look and book yourself into a session or two, or if you're planning to come to a few sessions, save yourself some dough and get one of these little beauties, the Emerge Festival Pass. As a special thing, we've scented these with poets' tears. Smells like sandalwood and regret. Last year, I had the great pleasure of being involved with publishing this book, which is Borderless anthology, edited by Melinda Smith, Yvette Henry Holt, and tonight's guest, Saba Vasefi. Inspired by the scope of this book and by, I guess, the international events that continue to create vast displacements of people and cultures that have challenged the notions of borders, I wanted to have a session that asked what it might mean to be borderless and to acknowledge and celebrate poetry as an art form globally practiced and revered. Our host tonight is Dr. Saba Vasefi, a multi-award-winning scholar, journalist, poet, and documentary filmmaker who teaches at, a few universities, including the University of Canberra, which she's just been telling me she has to get up very early to come down to. She is a writes for The Guardian on immigration issues and is an editor of Writing in Resistance, and of course was the chief editor of the Borderless anthology. Her poems have appeared in various journals, both in Australia and internationally, and she was twice a judge for the Dolatabadi Book Prize for the Best Book on Women's Literature and the BR4R Seeking Asylum Poetry Prize. So I'd like to hand it over to Saba now, and please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Shane, for having me tonight. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather tonight and thank them for sheltering me. Tonight in this session, we ask four poets, Lucy Van, Marjon Mossammaparast, Yasaman Bagheri, Madina Ahmad, to talk about what it might mean to be borderless and to speak and celebrate poetry as an art form universally practiced. Before we start the discussion, I would like briefly introduce each of our lovely panelists before, and then we start our discussion. Lucy Van writes poetry and criticism. She has been a writer in resistance at Overland and is an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne. Her first poetry collection is The Open, published in Kordite, which is long-listed for the Stella Prize. Marjon Mossammaparast is a secondary school English teacher in Melbourne. Her first collection of poetry, That Side, was published by Kordite, won the 2019 Mary Gilmore Award and was shortlisted for the 2019 Queensland Literary Awards. Yasaman Bagheri is a 24-year-old writer and a political refugee. In 2013, she fled Iran due to religious and political persecution and sought asylum in Australia. From the age of 15, she was incarcerated in Australia's offshore detention regime for a total of 5 years, moving between Christmas Island Detention Centre, Darwin Detention Centre, and the Australian-run Offshore Detention Centre on Nauru. In 2018, she was medically evacuated to Australia and is currently living in New South Wales. Yasaman is not allowed to study, but this has not stopped her from writing. Madina Ahmad is a 18-year-old poet from Brisbane. She says she's coming from an intersectional background that is often left her feeling isolated. She's passionate to explore the complexities of identity through writing and performing, and is excited to grow as a poet. Welcome to this panel. It is really special for me because for a long time I am researching about borderlessness, and after I published Borderless anthology, it was a huge learning process for me. And after publishing Borderless, I realized for some white Australians, borderlessness is limited to only the physical and visible borders, while for me, from my perspective, overcoming invisible borders of exclusion can be challenging as crossing the visible borders. So I am delighted to be part of this panel tonight and ask my fellow writers to see what they think about this notion. Let's start the question with Lucy. Lucy, reflecting on the power of literature to subvert or challenge division, censorship, and exclusion, what does borderlessness mean to you? Whom are you writing for? What are you expecting of the reader?
I feel like I'm here really to learn from everyone else on the panel. I don't know how to answer a lot of the questions you just asked, Saba, but I might begin with a kind of tangent. When I was thinking about the idea of borderlessness, I thought about what it is to write in specific zones. For instance, and I'm sure that other people on the panel would know about this feeling, there's something about being in an airport, and especially something about being on a plane that kind of loosens something when you're writing, or gives you, the first verse for something, that idea that the first verse is given to you for free. That always seems to happen to me when I'm in a zone that seems to be outside of a border. So I'm kind of thinking a little bit about that physical or geopolitical border in answering this question, but also thinking about a sort of another way of being unfixed, like not being, like in a very literal sense, grounded, seems to unlock something in the writing. As far as who do I write for, it could be that it would be a fellow traveller on the plane, someone who is also looking for a way to read in an errant way, in a way that's not circumscribed by particular codes or folkways. So something where I guess like a boundary limit has been crossed. That's what I think about when I think of borderlessness. And I'm sure, Saba, in your work and in your research around borderlessness, you've made a distinction between borderlessness and border crossing. Border crossing is something that I feel a little bit more confident in answering. I think that that's always really interesting. Let's say when a form of writing crosses like one physical space into another, like famously in the example of the haiku. But the idea of borderlessness, I think, is different from border crossing. So I don't know, that's my answer. It's not really a very definitive answer. I'm really looking forward to how everyone else answer this.
Of portability of living in a portable, having a portable life and living in a liminal zone. Thank you, Lucy, for your response. Marjon, what do you think? What does borderlessness mean to you, and whom are you writing for?
Thank you, Saba. I think as someone who has crossed a number of borders in my life, I started in Iran, and then we crossed the border and lived in Italy for a while and came to Australia, and then I've lived in China and Macau as well. So for me, my starting point would be to acknowledge that borders certainly exist. I think the idea of borderlessness, though, is, I think, a movement towards the recognition that despite the borders, there is a oneness, there is unity, there are things that bring us together and that transcend limitation. And I think, Lucy was mentioning travel, and I think certainly when you travel or when you live elsewhere, there is definitely a sense that despite the distinction, there is a humanity to us all. And I think that that's what my writing tries to explore. The distinction, but that movement or the search towards the things that bind us as well as what makes us unique. So I wouldn't say that I'm specifically writing for a particular or a group of readers, but I'd say that I'm trying to offer something to any reader that they can find that will help them to, I guess, question and move towards an understanding of what it means to be human. Acknowledging, as I said, that there are differences. We have skin. It stops our insides from spilling out. So that's a border. There are borders everywhere at many different levels. So I guess that's what I would offer by way of a starting point.
Thank you. What about you, Yasaman? What does borderlessness mean to you? I think your microphone is on mute.
So about my experiences in detention center in Nauru, or the journey to Australia, and I was in a different country to where I was from, and writing to an audience in Australia. So there was all this crossing between all these physical borders, and just poetry and writing was a way to cross all of that. And for me, I'm writing for anyone who can relate and understand that message that I'm trying to convey, a feeling in my poetry, because that's what I want the reader to see and feel and understand outside of this country, outside of their experiences and their political views, or just to see how it's like from the outside. So that is what borderlessness means to me, and this is the audience that I write to.
Lovely, thank you. How about you, Madina? What does borderlessness mean to you?
For me, I would say borderless really describes how I feel as a displaced person living in Australia. Every aspect of my identity really can't be defined by a border. I grew up here in Australia, but my parents are from Afghanistan, but even ethnically, I'm from an ethnic minority in Afghanistan. So there's all these layers, and no border has necessarily described any of those parts of my identity. Even being an Australian citizen, what does that even mean? Australia wasn't a thing until a couple of centuries ago. So there's so many layers. So borderless for me just encapsulates that sense of displacement that I feel. And I really write for mainly diaspora, but really anyone who's willing to listen. I think there's something so complex about our stories as people from the global south. So anyone who's willing to listen, I'm willing to write for. So yeah, that's what Borderless means to me.
Yeah, lovely. Stay with me, Madina. Let's start the other question with you again. How do you define the invisible borders of exclusion? How do you think can writing define these borders?
Well, I feel as though writing defies these borders because anyone can write. I'm looking at myself. I'm an 18-year-old. I never really had many experiences with writing, and I just picked up a pen, and that's how it happened. And that, like, class-wise, anyone can involve themselves in the art. So in terms of exclusion, it's so flexible, I guess. But yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Flexible in what way? What do you mean by flexibility?
Flexible as in it's not an art that's defined by what class you come from or what language you speak even. It's almost as if anyone can participate in this. It's not like another art form where you have to have this resume behind you. It's purely about self-expression.
Yeah, thank you. Lucy, how about you? How do you define the invisible borders of exclusion?
Um, I think I mean I have ambivalence. I guess I agree that writing has a liberatory kind of aspect to it, in the sense that anyone can pick up a pen and do it. But at the same time, I think there are lots of barriers to being in circulation in a particular kind of way. So while anyone can pick up a pen, not anyone can end up being read to the same extent. I think that there are lots of vectors of exclusion that would, be run along sort of class distinctions, racial and ethnic distinctions, gender, differences. All of these things come into play. I think that with an awareness and a sort of cultural maturity about the history of these exclusions, I think things are getting better. I think that there are lots of really strong publications. Let's take the example of Australia. Now, a lot of very sort of hardworking and courageous people have changed the way that we read in this country. And I think that there are a lot more stories, voices, and forms of expression available to the reading audience here because of the work around publication and who can be published. So yes, there are ways that exclusions still operate, but I think that looking at how things have changed even in the last 10 years, you can see that nothing is really fixed. So yeah, I think a lot of good change has happened. That's what I think.
Yeah, thank you. Marjon, how about you? How do you define the invisible borders of exclusion? And I would like to, because you experience, to live in different countries as an expatriate female writer, and would you like to share some of your experience or give some example about these invisible borders that led to some form of exclusion and marginalization?
Sure. I mean, I guess personally, to be honest, I don't feel, I wouldn't describe my life as being one of exclusion. I've always felt pretty much included in the societies that I've operated in and that I've lived in. I think certainly when there's a language barrier, that can make it very difficult to communicate at a particular level and to form relationships at a particular level. But I feel like I've always been quite, in a way that I acknowledge is lucky. I feel I've been, an active participant in my own life wherever I've lived. So I feel quite, as I said, privileged in that manner. And it's led to, I guess, a position where I feel like I've been able to make a contribution. So for me, I understand that those barriers exist. I think, as Lucy said, certainly opening up our societies to different stories has been very important and has given opportunity for lots of other voices to be heard. And I think in terms of writing defying borders, I quite prefer other verbs to describe that process. I like the idea of expanding, of enlarging, of furthering, of elevating experience rather than working, with that zone of exclusion as a starting point. So I guess that's what I would have to say.
Thank you. How about you, Yasaman? What do you think?
For me personally, the borders of exclusions that I felt were both subtle or direct at times. So it was more the feeling that I was given a predetermined place and I was not allowed to come out of that place. So for me to write and use poetry and writing as a platform to just come out of that predetermined place and tell my story the way I want to tell it, not the way that it's been told for so many years on the media, without me or people like me to have a voice in it. So just to have that that freedom to come out of those borders of being put in a place and having my freedom taken away is just something I explore in writing poetry.
Lovely. Lucy, let's talk about the form of your work. What are some of the forms you find yourself gravitating towards? What sort of form do you use to express yourself, to convey your message?
It's funny, I didn't really know that I gravitated towards a form, but I do. But I didn't know that I did until after I finished the draft of my book. So the form that I gravitate towards is prose, short prose poems, and I guess it's crossed a border. Like, I guess prose poetry begins maybe in France or maybe in the United States, and has sort of gone all over the world. I'm not really sure why, but I at the same time I have a feeling it is a sort of a resistant form, rejects the constraints of a metrical line, all of that sort of stuff. For me, I found that the prose form could accommodate a particular voice, a way that I wanted the voice to sound on the page. Sometimes I do experiment with, I guess, what you'd call a lyric poem, but yeah, I for whatever reason, the prose form is something that I feel can say what I want it to say. Yeah, but I didn't ever make that intentional decision to do things that way.
Would you like to share some of your work with us? Would you like to read some of your work tonight for us?
I can. I need to sort of dig around.
Yeah, sure. I can ask the question from another poet until you get ready.
Okay, sure.
Lovely. How about you, Marjon? What sort of form do you use, or what sort of form you're, passionate about to express yourself and convey your message?
I find certainly with my second volume, And to Ecstasy, which just came out last month actually, I found that a very different writing process to the first collection, that Sant, which was really a compilation of work that I'd been writing across many years. With And to Ecstasy, I sat down and I had a very clear project, I think, in mind, and it cohered right from the beginning. And what I found myself really developing in terms of my style was a form that enabled dialogue. So if you have a look at that collection, you'll see that quite often there are two columns. There's the left hand and there's the right hand. And I think what that enables me to do is to have a conversation with the self, with the speaker. And through that to not only to observe, but to reflect, to contemplate, to complicate as well. And through that to layer the meaning that I'm trying to capture. We know that, language itself creates borders. Language itself is border. And so I think through my writing, having lots of different ways of probing and adopting forms that enable that while still harmonizing, I think, and pulling maybe not towards the center, but across the whole, speaking in ways that look at the same thing through different perspectives. That's what I find that I've gravitated towards with this particular second collection.
And would you like to read from that collection?
Sure, but I'll just have to run and grab a copy as well, like Lucy. If you just give me a few minutes,
We will get back to you again. How about you, Yasaman?
I think the form that I'm most comfortable with is free verse, and because it just gives me the freedom that I want. When I want to write, I just want to flow. I don't want to stop and think about the rules, and also, like, as English is not my first language, I don't have the time sometimes to stop and make sure everything rhymes or I find the right words. So it's just about that flow, which free verse gives me that freedom.
Lovely. And are you ready to read one of your works?
Yeah, like I would be happy to. Thank you.
That's great to hear.
Do you want me to read it now or at the end?
Yeah, now.
Okay. I've got the poem from the Borderless anthology. It's called Drowned on Shore. Reborn from the water, I am undrowned. It rains between the children's eyebrows, and with every drop their floating corpses sink deeper into the sea. Among the myriad corpses I survived, to remember their displaced faces. Her eyes were blue like a drop from the Pacific Ocean. It was as if she was shouting, I was here. A 5-year-old girl, red nail polish on her little fingers, firmly attached to the boat rope. The mothers and fathers, one hand raised to pray, the other on their children's shoulders. The wave was a dreadful death, rolling towards us whose shore was not our home. Either the generous sea embraced us, the banished, and we could die from suffocation or perish later from withdrawal syndrome in a moldy tent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And while you are here, let's ask you another question, because for a long time we are working together to convey, the message of not you, but so many other children from inside detention as a journalistic pieces. And you are courageously, you are a journalist yourself, I think, because you are the person who sent me so many material from inside detention to write. And how do you think cyberspace space and digital platforms liberated creative expression and enable you to express yourself and send your messages?
Yeah, I think it gave us all that freedom that was taken away. So it was that sneaky way of conveying something to the outside, and just crossing that border that was so tight. So I remember when you and I worked together, was me on the phone from the inside telling you about everything, and you working on an article, in Australia. So that's how it all started. And I think the importance of digital platform can't be stressed enough for people who, their only way out is that. And I've lived that, I've experienced that, and we still have those people that their only way to get their message out, their workout is, to sneak a mobile phone inside the detention center. So I think that we were lucky to have that opportunity, and obviously took a lot of risks just to even talk to you back then. It was illegal, So, but I'm glad we did it. I look back now, and I think it was all worth it, and it started the journey for me, and I'm happy that I did that.
Yeah, lots of admiration to you. And
Thank you.
thank you. And what about you, Madina? What is the form that you choose to write?
I typically write in free verse, sorry, because I am super new to the art. So when I first started writing, it was more just regurgitating whatever I had heard. My first exposure to poetry had been Farsi poetry from my parents, and my family members were poets back in Afghanistan. And, I'm Muslim, so in a sense, our scripture is divine poetry. So there were all these influences. So when it came to writing my own, I didn't want to be restricted by rules simply because I didn't know them as well. And when I write, I write to perform. So I write as if my voice is speaking the poem. So yeah, I'd say free verse is the form that I gravitate towards.
And would you like to read some of your work tonight for us?
I think I have to look to see what I have.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Thank you to Lucy, and then while you are getting ready to read. Lucy, are you ready to read one of your work for us tonight?
Me?
Lucy, yeah.
Yeah, I also just realized that my poems are really quite long, so I might just read the end of one of the poems, if that's okay.
Sure.
So it's two different prose paragraphs. At the funeral, George reads some poetry by Yanis Ritsos, his father's favorite poet, maybe George's favorite poet. An enlightening moment is when one of George's Thomastown friends, Costas, says to me in passing, "If you don't know George's dad, you can't understand George." The mourners place a red carnation in the coffin. I take a red carnation with me from the chapel. I realize with surprise that I already have a vase full of red carnations at home, which have been opening over 3 weeks. One of the poems in English translation has a line about where a shadow will always fall, how hard the hard work of our fathers presses. I didn't go back to the house. I don't know why. I came here to write this instead. It only occurs to me now that if I had gone, I would have had a good look at that door. My fascination with this door is irrational because there is nothing exceptional about a door like this. Many suburban houses built in Australia have this door. The house I grew up in, for instance. Strangely, I realised much later, so does the house I live in now. There is nothing strange about this. This is a standard Australian door.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Are you ready, Marjon, to read your work?
Sure, Saba, yes. So I'll just show it to you so you can see what it looks like on the page with the
Yes.
so one column here and one column there, and they speak to one another, and you can read them in a number of different ways. So I'll just read down. Out of Eden by Island Tim's Road, we pulled over to pause for the forest. Strange to be one with the living that has died, filled with mourning. New leaves wrapped around black trees, black skeletons in green. Let's make a decision to wake up early and take the walking track down, where the pelican humbugs the lake. To love here and fish here while we are falling, and on our heads drift char and ribbon and ash. Venturing after the verge, the ascending arc where limbs are each to each as logic. And that was written driving towards Malakuta, which I'm sure you remember was burnt out in the fires a few years ago. That's it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Madina, are you ready to read one of your work?
I actually pulled out my diary for this one because, we're talking about borderlessness, and I wrote this piece after the Taliban took control of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, and I'll just read out a little bit of what I wrote. And it's about having survivor's guilt, watching your country burn to the ground and you're just living in privilege and you're grieving from afar. So I'll just read the last part. To survive is to grieve for a home that does not exist anymore. Grieve for every life that died there. Grieve for the part of you that died with them. Tell me, how do you murder a corpse? I have nostalgia from periods I have never lived, deja vu from places that I have never visited, and somewhere there is soil that yearns to kiss the bottom of my feet, begs to be nourished by what is left of my body. Maybe home is between the first and last letter of this poem. And Hiraeth, a Welsh word describing a longing for a home you cannot return to, or that never was, dies. And to utter it is to exhale for the very last time. That's about the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what do you think, Madina, about cyberspace and digital platforms? For young generation who might not have great access to some literary journals or magazines, and publication always at the beginning of the work it can be challenging. How do you think these kind of digital platforms empower new generation to tell their story?
I come from quite a privileged point of view because I am growing up in Australia and I do have access to all these platforms, but at the same time I'm quite young, so there's that shift where I have lots of access, but at the same time I'm still a young person in Australia. So in terms of
how much these platforms helped you to be connected, to networking and be connected to the, journals, to magazines, to get published.
well, there is that difficulty if you don't have your connections, but it does help significantly, because of, online, I was able to get in contact with Queensland poetry. I do have to acknowledge that because of these digital platforms, I would have not been writing poems at this moment in time. But at the same time, there is those barriers where if you don't have that digital literacy, you're almost excluded.
Yeah. How about you, Lucy? What do you think about cyberspace and digital platforms?
I think about it from the point of view of the reader, actually. I think it's such a great time to be able to read poetry. I don't know because it's sort of before my time, but I feel like it wouldn't have been as possible to access the kind of poetry that we can now, like say 15 or 20 years ago, or before that. And then perhaps people would have been reading poetry in a particular kind of I don't want to say silo, but with particular kind of limitations. Whereas there's a sort of a promiscuity to reading now, where you can read, I don't know, John Milton, or like someone who's an emerging poet from like a a regional town or something. Like there's all of these ways you can cross types of poetry or other types of text as well. And I think that this ability to read so widely will also change the way that we write poetry. It has to. So I think that they're interlinked. I think there's a lot of new possibilities afforded by like this digital era. I think there's also a lot of kind of difficult things too, but focusing on those positive things, I think it's a great time to be reading poetry. And I think people do read more poetry than they did a decade ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about you, Marjon? What do you think? For example, tonight we can connect, because before you spoke about togetherness, getting together, and for example, tonight each of us from different cities, we are gathering together. And what do you think? How do you think cyberspace and digital platforms liberated creative expression?
Yeah, look, I think obviously it's wonderful because of the access that it's provided, and all of the voices that it has enabled us to hear and to emerge, tell their story. That democratization of the art form. I think, as with all of these processes that that sort of have evolved through the digital platform. I think about the news media, for example, enabling sort of citizen journalists to take footage from the ground and say, this is what's happening now, and this is what's happening to me. It provides that personal face. It allows us to connect at an individual level. So I think there are, really it's a force that we need to celebrate. I think obviously it becomes, as with anything, it becomes complex. And I think that we need to acknowledge that too, because, we have the citizen journalists, we have the journalists, who tell their stories in long form, who get published on certain platforms. I think it's the same when you look at poetry or if you look at art. And I think it leads us to the hard, difficult, interesting question of what is poetry and what is art and where can we access it. And I think that there is definitely space for all of those platforms, and for print magazines, and for individual volumes, compilations, and I think we have to make space for all of them. And as I said, I think at some point it will get tricky.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. And thank you, Shane, for bringing us together, and the audience who are watching us tonight, and whoever concerned about exclusion, and whoever try to do their best for more inclusive and more diverse community. And well done to all of them. And you're one of them, absolutely, Shen. Thanks so much for facilitating this panel tonight and having us all together to bring in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saba, and thank you, Lucy, Yasaman, Madina, and Marjon. And wow, just wow, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for participating in Emerge Online and being part of the festival. Everybody who is tuning in, hang on, I've just got to get myself on there. There we go. Everybody, again, thank you to our wonderful panelists, to Saba, and everyone who's helping out with making this festival come alive. Our next Emerge Online event is happening on April the 28th. And it's a reading this time by Jackie Malins, who's from Canberra, and Scott Patrick Mitchell from Perth. So we hope that you can check out the website and look at everything that's coming up with the Queensland Poetry Festival. and also that you'll consider joining us up in Meanjin, Brisbane, when the live festival happens in June. My name is Shane Strange, and I want to thank you all very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you again. See you later.